One of the most exciting nights of my life was the night my husband let me play with his nephew. It all began a few weeks ago, when the sun set, casting a gentle orange glow over the city skyline. From the window of our townhouse, I watched the evening settle in, the faint sounds of distant conversation mingling with the hum of traffic below. Normally, this kind of calm brought me peace, but tonight it left a weight in its place. Robert, my husband, had left earlier that afternoon for a weekend work retreat. It wasn't the first time he'd gone away for business, but his departure today felt different. Maybe it was the request he'd made as he kissed my cheek goodbye. "Evelyn," he'd said, lingering for a moment, "keep an eye on James. While I'm gone, he's still figuring things out, and I don't want him to feel like a guest. Make him feel at home." James, his nephew, just 19, had been staying with us for a couple of weeks, fresh out of high school and preparing for college in the city. He'd arrived at our door with bags slung over his shoulders and an endearing mix of shyness and gratitude. Robert had insisted we take him in for a while to help him get settled. I hadn't minded. James was polite, respectful, and had a certain quiet charm that was easy to be around still. The house felt different with Robert gone. The dynamic between James and me had always been cordial. But tonight, as the sky deepens to twilight and the house settled into its usual evening stillness, I felt a subtle shift. Maybe it was the absence of his steady presence, or perhaps something I couldn't quite put my finger on. At 7, I heard the familiar creak of the stairs. James appeared in the doorway to the living room, his dark hair slightly tousled. Dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, he gave me a small smile as he stepped inside, the kind that made him look younger than he was. "Hey, Auntie Evelyn," he greeted, his voice soft and warm. "Robert told me you'd be here all weekend." "That's right," I said, setting aside from the book I hadn't really been reading. "He didn't want you to feel abandoned." He laughed lightly, sitting down on the couch across from me. "He worries too much." "I'm fine." We fell into a cozy silence, and I couldn't help but notice how he was lying on the couch, his long legs spread wide, his posture relaxed. He seemed more at ease tonight than I had ever noticed before. "You're hungry?" I asked, and he admitted, sitting up a little. "What's for dinner?" I asked. "Let's work it out." I rose up and gestured for him to accompany me to the kitchen. We decided on something straightforward: pasta with a quick homemade sauce. James offered to help, and we moved around the kitchen in a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. He chopped vegetables with precision, his hands steady and sure, while I stirred the pot on the stove. The atmosphere between us was light and full of anecdotes and jokes. "You're not bad at this," I said, looking at him as he skillfully diced a tomato. "Neither are you," he smiled. After dinner, we moved back to the living room, where James took his usual sprawled position on the couch, his body stretching out as though he owned the space. "I thought you'd burn water," but I couldn't help laughing when the food was ready. Conversation flowed easily as the soft glow of the overhead light cast a warm ambience over the room. His plans for college were thoughts on the city and a few funny stories about Robert from his childhood. He spoke with a quiet confidence that drew me in, and I kept looking at him. Tonight, he exuded a kind of comfort and assurance that was both novel and captivating. After some time, he broke the silence and said, "Thanks for dinner." "It's no trouble," I remarked. "It was nice you didn't have to do all that." I liked it. There was another pause, this one heavier, and James's eyes met mine. For a moment, it seemed like the room had shrunk around us, and the air was thick and charged with something that was not spoken but could be felt. "I think I'll head to bed soon," he said, without getting up. "Yeah," I said quietly, though my heart was pounding in my chest. He lingered for a moment longer, his gaze shifting over me in a way that seemed purposeful. And then he stood and stretched. "Good night, Auntie Evelyn." Something had changed tonight, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I just knew that I wasn't ready to let the night end just yet. "James." I watched him retreat up the stairs, the sound of his footsteps fading as he disappeared into the hallway. I sat there for a long time after the weight of the moment pressed down on me. The house was quiet now, save for the faint ticking of the wall clock and the occasional creak of the wooden floors as the night settled in. I stayed in the living room for a while, staring at the flickering light of the fireplace, my thoughts circling back to James. There had been something in his demeanor tonight, an energy I couldn't quite place but couldn't ignore either. Eventually, I made my way upstairs, my steps soft on the carpeted stairs. The hallway was dimly lit only by the faint glow of the nightlight near the guest room. James's door was slightly ajar, and I hesitated as I passed it, the sound of his soft breathing reaching my ears. I shook my head, trying to clear my mind. This was ridiculous. I headed to my bedroom, shutting the door behind me, but even as I changed into pajamas and climbed into bed, my thoughts kept drifting back to him. His easy smile, the way his eyes lingered on mine just a beat too long. I turned over, staring at the ceiling, my chest tight with a strange mix of emotions I couldn't fully name. Sleep wouldn't come. The stillness of the house felt oppressive, the silence loud in my ears. I wasn't sure what compelled me, but after what felt like hours, I found myself slipping out of bed. My bare feet were silent against the floor. As I moved down the hallway, my steps guided by some unspoken pull. James's door was still ajar, the faint light from his bedside lamp casting a soft glow into the hallway. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. James, the first, called softly, barely above a whisper. There was a rustle of movement from inside, and then his voice, low and warm. "Yeah." I pushed the door open, gently stepping inside. He was sitting up in bed, the blankets pulled around his waist. His dark hair was muse, his eyes heavy, light with sleep but alert. I admitted, standing awkwardly by the door. He smiled faintly, his head tilting slightly. Me neither. For a moment we just looked at each, the weight of the silence filling the space between us. Then, almost hesitantly, James patted the empty space on the bed beside him. "Do you want to sit?" In a quiet but firm voice, he inquired. I hesitated, every rational part of me screaming that this was a bad idea, but there was something in his gaze and openness, a quiet vulnerability that drew me in. I crossed the room and purr on the edge of the bed, careful to keep a respectable distance. "Is something on your mind?" he asked, his tone gentle but curious. I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I don't know," I said finally, "just restless." I guess he nodded, his gaze steady on mine. "Me too." The air between us felt heavy again, thick with unspoken words and unacknowledged feelings. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye, taking in the sharp angles of his jaw, the curve of his lips. He looked different in the soft light, softer, more vulnerable. "I'm glad you're here," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. I turned to him, my brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his eyes dropping to his hands. "I don't know, it's just nice to have someone around, someone who gets it. I guess, gets what I asked." My voice barely above a whispered. He looked up at me, then his gaze piercing and raw. "What it's like to feel alone. Like no one really sees you." The honesty in his words hit me like a punch to the gut. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "I see you," I said softly, the words slipping out before I could stop them. His eyes widened slightly, and for a moment neither of us moved. Then slowly he reached out his fingers, brushing against mine. The touch was electric, sending a shiver down my spine. My breath hitched, and I looked at him, searching his face for some sign of what he was thinking. "James," I began, my voice trembling slightly, but he shook his head, cutting me off. "It's okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just need this, even if it's just for a moment." I didn't know what to say, in my mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. But as his fingers laced with mine, his touch warm and steady, I found myself leaning into him, the space between us dissolving. His other hand came up to cut my face, his touch gentle but firm. I closed my eyes, the world falling away as I surrendered to the moment. To him, our lips met tentatively at first, a soft brush of skin against skin. But then the kiss deepened, the heat between us building with each passing second. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I let my own hands finding their way to his shoulders. It was wrong, I knew that, but in that moment it felt like the most natural thing in the world. His lips were warm against mine, soft but insistent. I felt the weight of him, the closeness, the undeniable pull that had been simmering beneath the surface all evening. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat loud and frantic in the quiet of the room. "James," the first whispered against his mouth, unsure of what I was trying to say. Was I asking him to stop, to continue, even if I didn't know? But he didn't pull away. Instead, he deepened the kiss, his hands gripping my waist with a firmness that sent a shiver racing down my spine. I found myself leaning into him, my body responding in ways that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. He broke the kiss on his forehead, resting against mine as we both tried to catch our breath. His eyes searched mine, dark and intense, as if trying to gauge what I was. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, though my mind was spinning. "Yeah," I managed to say, though the word felt small and inadequate. He smiled faintly, his thumb brushing lightly against my cheeky. "Good," he said, his voice tinged with relief. For a moment we just sat there, the silence between us thick but not uncomfortable. I could feel his heartbeat against mine, the steady rhythm grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. But as the initial haze of the kiss began to fade, reality started to creep back in. The weight of what we were doing, of who we were to each other, loomed large in my mind. "This is crazy," I said finally, my voice trembling slightly. James chuckled softly, his breath warm against my skin. "Yeah," he agreed, his tone light but serious. "But it doesn't feel wrong, does?" I hesitated, the question hanging in the air between us. Did it feel wrong? My rational mind screamed that it did, that this was a line we should never have crossed. But my heart, my traitorous, aching heart, told a different story. "No," I admitted, the word slipping out before I could stop it. "It doesn't." His smile widened slightly, a flicker of something like hope in his eyes. "Then maybe it's not," he said softly, his hand still cradling my face. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that this moment, this connection, was something pure and right. But the fear, the doubt, lingered at the edges of my mind, threatening to pull me back to reality. "What if I began?" But the words caught in my throat. "What if this changes everything?" James shook his head, his gaze steady and unwavering. "It doesn't have to be said firmly. We can take it one step at a time. No pressure, no expectations, just this." He leaned in again, his lips brushing softly against mine, and I felt myself relax, the tension in my chest easing slightly. His hands moved to my back, pulling me closer, and I let him use my own hands, tangling in his hair. The kiss deepened, the heat between us building once more. His touch was careful but insistent, his movements deliberate and unhurried. It was as if he was taking his time, savoring every moment, every sensation. I lost myself in him, in the warmth of his embrace, in the way he made me feel seen, understood, wanted. It was intoxicating, overwhelming, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to simply feel. As the night stretched on, the boundaries between us blurred further, the connection between us growing stronger. With each passing moment, the world outside faded away, leaving only the two of us, lost in the quiet intimacy of the night. When we finally pulled away, our breathing heavy and our body pressed close, I looked at him, my heart full and heavy all at once. "This is going to complicate things, isn't it?" I said softly, a faint smile tugging at my lips despite the weight of my words. James grinned, his eyes sparkling with mischief and affection. "Probably," he admitted, "but I think it's worth it." I nodded, my chest tight with a mix of emotions I couldn't fully name. "Yeah," I said quietly. "Me so." James rested his head on my shoulder, his breath warm against my neck. In the room was silent, except for the soft hum of the night outside, the occasional creak of the house settling. I wrapped an arm around him, pulling him closer, and he sighed contentedly. We stayed like that for a while, the quiet between us filled with unspoken thoughts. I could feel the rhythm of his breathing, steady and calming, and it gave me a moment to collect myself. My mind raced, replaying everything that had just happened, touch, every glance, every whispered word. "I don't want this to be a one-time thing," James said suddenly. His voice, breaking the silence, was quiet but firm, laced with a vulnerability that made my chest tighten. I hesitated, my fingers tracing absent patterns on his back. "Neither do I admitted softly. "But I don't know how we make this work." James lifted his head to look at me, his eyes filled with a determination that caught me off guard. "We'll figure it out," he said. "We don't have to have all the answers right now. We just take it one day at a time." His words were reassuring, but the weight of the situation still lingered. The reality of what we'd done, of what we were now to each other, was a lot to process. But at the same time, the thought of letting this go, of letting him go, was unbearable. "Okay," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "One day at a time." He smiled, leaning in to press a soft kiss to my forehead. "That's all we need," he said, his words a quiet promise. We stayed like that for a while longer, wrapped up in each other, the rest of the world forgotten. Felt safe, comforting, like we'd found something we didn't even know we were looking for. Eventually, the night began to catch up with us, the weight of exhaustion settling in. James shifted, Pulling away slightly to look at we should probably get some sleep, he said, his voice tinged with reluctance. I nodded, though I didn't want to let go of him just yet. Yeah. I agreed, my own reluctance clear in my tone. But then he turned to look at me, his expression open and raw. I don't want to leave, he admitted, his voice trembling with vulnerability. I don't want this too, and I swallowed hard, my chest tightening at his words. Then don't, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Stay. His searched mine for a moment before he leaned in, his hand finding mine and holding it tightly. Are you sure? He asked, his voice barely audible, as if he was afraid of breaking the fragile connection between us. I'm sure, I said, and I meant it. Without another word, he closed the distance between us, his lips meeting mine in a kiss that was soft and tentative, but laced with an undeniable hunger. I responded instinctively to my hands finding their way to his face, pulling him closer. The world outside faded away as we lost ourselves in each other, the firelight casting flickering shadows across the room. Every touch, every kiss felt like a revelation, a deepening of the bond that had always been there but had only now come to light. It really went from bad to worse, and I did not know what a young guy was capable of. Wow. His touches were so amazing, and each time I thought it was the last time he was ready for another round. Eventually, I think we finished after 5 or 6 times. When we were done, James's hands slid up my arms, his touch sending shivers down my spine. I've wanted this for so long, he murmured against my lips, his voice thick with emotion. I just didn't know if you felt the same. I didn't realize it either, I admitted, my forehead resting against his. But now that I do, I don't want to stop. He smiled softly, his thumb brushing against my cheek. Then we won't. The hours stretched on as we explored this new territory together, each moment more intense and more intimate than the last. There was no hesitation, no fear, only a shared understanding that this was where we were meant to be. By the time the fire had burned down to embers, we were wrapped in each other's arms, our breathing slow and steady. James's head rested against my chest, and I ran my fingers through his hair, marveling at how right it all felt. This changes everything, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, pressing a kiss to his forehead. It does, I agreed. But it's a change I'm ready for. We'll figure this out together, one step at a time. James smiled, his eyes meeting mine with a warmth that made my heart ache. I trust you, said simply. I trust you, replied, my voice filled with conviction. As the night stretched on, we stayed there on the couch, wrapped in each other's warmth, unwilling to let the moment and whatever challenges lay ahead, we knew we would face them together, bound by a love that had finally been set free. The next morning I woke to the faint sound of birds outside the window and the soft creak of footsteps in the hallway. For a moment I wasn't sure if the events of the previous night had been real or some vivid dream, but the lingering warmth in my chest told me it was real. Every glance, every whispered word, every shared touch. I took a deep breath and got out of bed, pulling on a sweater. As I made my way to the kitchen, James was already there, standing by the counter with a cup of coffee in his hands. His hair was slightly messy, and he wore an oversized hoodie that made him look younger, more vulnerable. He looked up as I entered, his face breaking into a shy smile. He said, his voice soft but warm. Morning, I replied, my voice still groggy with sleep. I moved to pour myself a cup of coffee. In the silence between us, comfortable but charged, the weight of what we'd shared hung in the air, unspoken but ever-present. James leaned against the counter, watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. Are you okay? He asked, his voice laced with concern. I nodded, meeting his gaze. Yeah, I said, I'm okay. Are you? Hesitated for a moment before nodding. Yeah, he said, there was a slight tremor in his voice. It's just I can't stop thinking about last night. I set my coffee down and stepped closer to him, placing a hand on his arm. Me neither, I admitted, but it's a lot to process. We need to take this slow, figure out what this means for us. James nodded, his expression softening. I don't want to rush anything, he said. I just don't want to lose this. Lose you? You won't, I said firmly, squeezing his arm. We'll figure it out together. He smiled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. Thank you, he said softly. We spent the rest of the morning in quiet companionship, sharing small smiles and touches as we went about our day. There was an unspoken understanding between us, a mutual agreement to take things one step at a time. As the day wore on, I found myself watching James more closely, noticing the way he moved, the way he smiled, the way his eyes lit up when he laughed. It was like seeing him in a new light, And it filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. By the time evening rolled around, we found ourselves on the couch again, the soft glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows on the walls. James sat close to me, his shoulder brushing against mine. And I felt a quiet contentment settled over. "Do you think this is crazy?" he asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whispered. I turned to look at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his tone. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his gaze fixed on the fire. It's not exactly normal." I reached out, taking his hand in mine. "Maybe it's not normal," I said, "but it feels right. And that's what matters." He turned to look at me, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and uncertainty. "You really think so?" "I do," I said, my voice firm. "As long as we're honest with each other, as long as we're careful, we can figure this out together." James's smile was small but genuine, and he squeezed my hand tightly. "Thank you," he said, "for not running away, for giving this a chance." "I couldn't run away even if I wanted to," I said, a teasing smile tugging at my lips. "You're kind of hard to escape." He laughed, the sound light and genuine, and it filled me with a quiet joy. In that moment, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. As the night wore on, we stayed like that, side by side, the warmth of the fire and the comfort of each other's presence wrapping around us like a blanket. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was ours. And I think that was enough. I'm not sure if it is okay what I did. And I haven't told Robert anything yet. Should I tell him? I don't know. I just don't know.